So let's get into this. You argue in this piece that essentially gun suicides should not be counted as gun violence, especially when discussing gun restrictions or policies to that regard, gun laws, essentially. Can you just give us a quick breakdown of your basic argument here?
So the basic argument is that, of course, suicide matters, including suicides that are gun-related. In fact, it matters a lot because gun-related suicides are responsible for over 20,000 losses a year. So this is a massive amount of suffering, and it needs to be addressed. The problem, though, I think, and this is me speaking as an advocate, you might have a different take as a journalist, is that these gun control organizations, they seem to want to use suicide to inflate the count, but their policies don't actually really touch on suicide, except for a couple that conceivably could, which I covered in the piece. So when they talk about this gun violence rate or the gun deaths, they want the layperson to evoke images of criminals, mass shooters, general homicides, and assaults. What they don't really implicate there is suicide. But if you ever push them on this, and I have, they'll say, "What, you don't think suicide matters?" And it's like, no, of course it does. But this is a very distinct problem that is separate, I think, from what gun control purports to solve generally, except for the few that call for a complete ban on guns, I guess, because as I mentioned in the piece, things like assault weapons bans, magazine capacity limits, they don't matter to suicide. I mean, it's grim to say, but you can kill yourself just fine with a flintlock pistol. It doesn't take much to be effective in that grim task. So that's where I come from on this. And sorry, I know that's a bit more advocacy, but that's what I am. So.
No, certainly. And just give us an idea. In your piece, you talk about the breakdown between gun violence and gun suicide. Like how much of an effect does including suicides in a gun violence count have on that final number?
Well, it more than doubles it, because suicides most years are, I think, around 55 or 60%. I think now, because of the surge in homicides, the proportion of suicide has actually fallen a bit, but it's still a majority. I think the number, let me pull up the piece here. The number was suicides in 2020 were 53.7% of gun-related deaths, and homicides were 42.9%, and the remaining balance were, accidents, law enforcement shootings, and undetermined. So
right, and that comes from the CDC.
That's the right? CDC numbers, yes. So that's my good friends at the CDC, but that's where those numbers come from, yeah.
And they get those by asking coroners, essentially, are required to report
correct
these numbers to the CDC. So it's a fairly reliable method of determining this, right?
It's the most comprehensive that exists, as far as I know. So yeah, it's what we have to rely on. Yeah.
Right, because obviously there's a lot of things when it comes to guns in America where you're dealing with things that are more like estimates,
right?
Like close guesses. You're using survey-based information that tries to come up with a statistically significant group of people to ask, but isn't a one-to-one like this. This is a little more reliable, perhaps, these numbers, because they are literally all of the coroner's reports from across the entire country, and it's based on what the coroners are saying about these deaths that they're recording.
And correct. And I think it's also worth adding, for the homicide numbers, the 43% approximately that are homicides, is that the CDC is kind of agnostic on what a homicide is when it comes to, it just says it's gun related. So that includes, for example, it doesn't include law enforcement because they categorize that differently, but it does include justified homicide. So a few of those are certainly not murders. They're justified homicides. So that's worth
right
too.
And that's also why when we talk about crime statistics, of course, you get it's important to understand where these numbers come from. So most crime statistics, when you're talking about murder, people aren't citing the CDC numbers. Because CDC doesn't give you a lot of information about the homicide, just that there was a homicide, and the type of weapon used is categorized to a broad degree, like guns. But most people will cite FBI numbers when it comes to homicide.
Well, we can't anymore.
Right. Yes. It's a significant problem now because the FBI changed their method of collecting homicide data, or really all crime data, in 2020, which is probably the worst possible time to do it, and they haven't had good compliance rates from police departments. But I'm just getting at the point that these numbers are going to be a little bit different from the FBI to the CDC because of the way they go about collecting them. The FBI will give you more detailed numbers, especially back when they had a more they had a lot better compliance with their reporting system pre-2020. So you look at the 2019 numbers, those are sort of the last really solid numbers the FBI had. But they delve into more about the victims and the types of weapons beyond just guns. That's where you get a lot of like rifles are involved in 500 murders a year or so, including all.
And
rifles,
they do distinguish between murders and other kinds of homicide as well, which is important. Yeah.
And the CDC doesn't do that.
No.
And so this is sort of a different set of numbers. It's reliable for the reasons we talked about, but it's different than what you're probably used to hearing if you're someone out there listening to reports on murder in the United States, because a lot of those focus on the FBI numbers because they're a bit more detailed. But their collection methods are different. So, I just think it's important to note where these numbers come from and what we're talking about here. But from what we understand, generally speaking, and this is backed up with, as you said, there's been a slight change the last couple of years because of the murder surge that we've experienced in the United States. But generally speaking, suicides are far more common than murders when it comes to gun deaths. That's the basic point, right?
Yes, it's undeniable. In fact, if anything, the homicide surge has reduced that a bit, but in every year till now, as far as I'm aware, suicides are a majority of
usually it's
deaths.
closer to 2/3. Right?
Yes, 60%, 2/3, something like that most years. Yeah.
But you will often see gun control advocates use gun death rate, right?
Yes. Look, there is value to a measure of gun-related death, which is what I prefer to call it. But you have to be clear about what you're talking about. So if you're going into if, for example, you were writing an article and said, we need to deal with guns, and you say in the beginning, guns are used in homicides, they're used in suicides, and this is our total gun-related death. They don't do that. They don't say the word suicide usually unless they're pressed on it. And then they'll say, they'll go into it a little bit. But if you're not being transparent and you're just saying gun deaths or gun violence, people aren't thinking about suicide because that's not what the word violence evokes, and when you're thinking about gun deaths, you're usually thinking about, and they do this very purposefully, a criminal attacking someone, not suicide.